After winning the Super Bowl in the 2012 season, the Baltimore Ravens found themselves in an unfamiliar position that was at 8-8 and outside of the playoffs in 2013. So it was going to be interesting to see what they ended up doing in 2014. Was it going to be more of the same, or were they going to kind of right the ship and get things back to normal, if you will? And in a lot of ways, it was back to normal for the Baltimore Ravens. Another season, another playoff appearance, another playoff victory, which is something that was very common under the John Harbaugh, Joe Flacco regime. And the Ravens, made a good season for themselves, going 10-6, finding a way into the playoffs, beating the Steelers in the wild card round, which I'm sure felt extra sweet for them. And then losing a heartbreaker in the divisional round to the New England Patriots. They twice had a 14-point lead on the Patriots. If that isn't a choke, I don't know what is. That most certainly was a choke. And it's not the first time you could argue that the Ravens had choked against the Patriots in big-time spots. Go back to the 2011 AFC Championship game as a perfect example. But now you've got the Baltimore Ravens, who made it back in the playoffs in 2014, 2 years removed from winning the Super Bowl, but a year removed from missing the playoffs. And you wonder what's going to happen next. Could be a team that's in a bit of a transition period, and it's understandably so. And part of the reason they're in that transitional period, I think, frankly, is because their team got kind of old, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and hasn't particularly drafted as well in recent years to address some of those areas of future needs, some of those areas where they needed depth, as much as many have been led to believe. That's not to say that the Ozzie Newsome regime has been a failure. No, he's got the 2 Lombardi trophies to assert that he's been anything but. The consistency and the relevance of the organization to suggest that it's anything but. However, with all the great things that I could say about Ozzie Newsome, the Baltimore Ravens draft history over the past few years hasn't been all that particularly great. Sure, they hit on second-round picks like Torrey Smith and Kalichi Osemele. They really hit big on their first-round pick from 2014, C.J. Mosley, a guy who I questioned them taking because I like the player more than I like the fit and the position they took him in. In this particular case, I was dead wrong. But the hits have been too few and far between. You go back to, even Torrey Smith. He's no longer with the organization, so that's a former marquee pick that's gone. You talk about Sergio Kindle, second-round pick from 2010, never really did anything at all. Lots of questions still. You go back to their 2013 draft. First-round picks like Matt Elam and second-round picks like Arthur Brown. Brown's contributed absolutely nothing. And you look at Elam, he's been bad enough to where people still consider safety to be a big need for that organization, even though they spent a first- and third-round pick in the last 2 drafts on Matt Elam and then Terrence Brooks in 2014. While that 2014 draft class, I think, is one of the better ones the Ravens have had in some times, it's still, I don't think, in a lot of ways enough, and it doesn't address some of the areas of concern and some of the real areas that needed depth. This is a defense that, like I said, has gotten old in a hurry, and they don't necessarily have the young pieces in place, and when they do get a young piece in place, a lot of times because of the current salary cap environment, they have to let them go. See Paul Kruger, see Pernell McPhee. And all the while, what happens is some of those guys that you do find that you get in the wings, you end up having to let go, and it just makes the situation worse. And this offseason certainly wasn't kind to the Baltimore Ravens. They traded away Haloti Ngata. It was understandable. Here's a guy that's on the wrong side of 30 that's owed a lot of money. Need to clear up some salary cap space. And as nice as he's been, he's not the same player as he once was. Still very good, but he's not as great and dominant as he once was. However, Haloti Ngata is even very good. Don't grow on trees every single day. And while they did a nice job of being able to get a couple mid-round picks for him, they still only got a couple of mid-round picks for a guy that's been a multiple-time Pro Bowler and All-Pro. And you talk about the loss of Torrey Smith. Again, former second-round pick, didn't have the best 2014, as some of the emphasis went to Steve Smith Sr., but here's a explosive playmaker on the outside at times, and now you're talking about one of your starting wide receivers is gone. Owen Daniels, a tight end that did very nicely for you in Gary Kubiak's system in 2014, he's now followed Gary Kubiak to Denver. Talk about Pernell McPhee, that outside linebacker that provided nice depth behind Terrell Suggs and Elvis Dumerville, has now left in free agency to go sign with the Chicago Bears. So these are a lot of guys that are lost, and outside of Ngata, you don't get anything back for them. And at some point in time, that does start to catch up with an organization. And I believe in some ways that has finally caught up to the Baltimore Ravens. And I'm not expecting them to fall off of a cliff in 2015, because they still have some of the pieces in place to be able to contend. They have a lot of good infrastructure in that organization. But the fact of the matter is, this is a very important draft for the Baltimore Ravens, because their period of time to potentially contend for a championship I don't think is all that particularly big. And when you look at it, like I said, their defense has gotten old and frankly isn't that good. It just isn't as good as you would have come to expect out of a Baltimore Ravens defense, especially when they need to be the most. And you look at the divisional round playoff game against the New England Patriots, that was not a great stellar offense, and they managed to hang up 35 on them. I mean, just think about that for a second. That defense didn't show up when they needed them to show up. So when you look at the biggest needs for this organization, you've got needs on both sides of the ball. In terms of offense, I think by far their biggest need is at wide receiver. This is a position that they probably should address multiple times in this draft, and I expect them to address multiple times in this draft. Torrey Smith is gone. Jacoby Jones is gone. You've now got a, going to be 36-year-old Steve Smith Sr., and then what the fuck else do you got? They need an option on the outside, maybe two. They need to draft a slot guy. Some of you might say, well, what about a Campanaro? Okay, that's fine, but they still need reinforcements at wide receiver. Joe Flacco needs help on that side of the ball. The Ravens need to be able to score more points and, more in particular, make some explosive plays happen. Something that I thought that was lacking in a lot of ways from their offense at times in 2014. This is a good draft for wide receivers yet again. This is a good draft for the Ravens to find both a guy that could profile to a future #1 wide receiver, a short-term #2 wide receiver opposite Steve Smith, and be able to find that quick twitch type of explosive athlete out of the slot that you can do a bunch of different things with. But I expect a lot of the emphasis on this draft to be on the defensive side of the ball, as it should be. They need some depth at defensive end. Over the past couple of years, you've watched Arthur Jones walked out the door. You've traded away Haloti Ngata. You could say Timmy Jernigan's in place, and that's all fine and good. But you could still use some depth and talent on the defensive line, in particular at the end position. They also could use some depth at edge rusher. They lost Pernell McPhee. Courtney Upshaw, I thought, was better in 2014, but there's a reason he still hasn't fully unseated either Terrell Suggs or Elvis Dumervil. And you look at both Suggs and Dumervil, two guys, again, that are on the wrong side of 30, that carry a big price tag to them. Some point in time, the Ravens are going to have a decision with one or both of those guys. So they could use some edge rushing depth, and this is a class of edge rushers that is pretty good. So it's a position the Ravens should be able to upgrade their depth at some point in time in this draft. But I think the biggest need on defense has got to be in the secondary. Their corners are bad. Yes, they re-signed Jimmy Smith, but outside of 2014, he hasn't been all that particularly good, and they really didn't have much else at corner other than him. And again, safety is still an issue, even with drafting guys like Matt Elam and Terrence Brooks. They really don't have that force back there in the back half of that secondary. In terms of their draft philosophy, I expect the Ravens to kind of stay more true to their form, looking for guys that were productive players at big schools maybe early, and then finding guys that fit their system later on in the draft. I do expect them to have a defensive-heavy lean. However, I do expect them to spend one of their first 2 picks on a wide receiver, and then probably a day 3 pick on a wide receiver as well, which I think would be the wise decision. In terms of pick 26, that wide receiver could come there. It's very, very possible. You've got guys from Philip Dorsett. If a Breshad Perryman is there, he might fit. Philip Dorsett from Miami, he might fit there. But in terms of other positions, a corner could work there. A safety, maybe a Landon Collins fits what they want to do, and therefore they bring him in at number 26. They could go to an edge rusher. Maybe they decide to gamble on a Randy Gregory if he's there at number 26, or if a Shane Ray happens to drop that far, maybe they decide to gamble on him. It'll be a very interesting draft to watch for the Baltimore Ravens, because while their 2014 draft class ended up being all right and being productive, it was one of their more productive draft classes they frankly had in some times. They need another one, because otherwise you might be surprised with the slide that the Ravens take in 2015.